We are going to go into our new sermon series called Your Story. And I asked some of you guys to help with that by having them give a message about what God is calling for, talking to, or what story that they have gone through, but to share it with you, okay? So without further ado, I introduce your speaker for tonight, Olivia Taylor.
You guys can hear me okay? Alright, so how many of you guys have been eating like a bag of chips and there's just a few left, right? Or maybe you're eating some cookies and you just have only 2 left. And then your friend walks up to you and they ask for one of them. I mean, how annoying is that? You're enjoying your delicious bag of food, you only have a little bit of it, and your friend walks up. I know I get really frustrated at that. And it's almost worse when you actually tell them yes, and then they take the best chip. Or the best cookie. I mean, you guys know the one. It's the chip with all the seasoning, or it could be the biggest chip. It's the one that you were saving for last. Have you guys been there before? I think we all have. I mean, I get angry just thinking about it. But this also relates to our spiritual lives. Sometimes we get really excited about something, but God begins to call us to let it go. Maybe there's a good opportunity, but God's calling us to something else. Today, I want to focus on this idea of not really wanting to let go. We want to hold on to something so tightly because there's a chance that if we let it go, we might lose it. We're going to read through John 6, 1 through 15 today, and I want to see if you guys can figure out who we're going to be talking about. It says, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That's the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. So Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one who had a bite." And for some context, that's about $30,000 today. So that's not really possible for them to just go to the store and buy that much bread. Then another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" I want to stop here, because I don't know about you guys, but 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish sounds like a lot of food. When I was in kids ministry, I was like, why would a little boy need such a big feast for lunch? It might not feed all 5,000 people, but why would he have so much food? Well, when we actually look at the context of this passage, we realize that this is more like 5 small crackers or 5 small loaves, and maybe sardine-sized fish. So it really wasn't a lot of food. Then Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, so they all sat down, and about 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, he gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, and let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. I know that the cool part of this story is Jesus. I mean, he took just a small amount of food and made it to feed 5,000 people. But today, I want to focus on the little boy, the one who had brought just a small lunch for him, and then he gave it up to all of these people. There's not much that we know about this little boy, but I'm going to tell you 4 things that we do know. And I don't know if that's on the screen, but I did add an extra one earlier. So first, this little boy was poor. In our society, we might think that the 2 fish or the 5 loaves are big, but these were barley loaves. And barley loaves were reserved for irrational animals or people in very poor circumstances. So this wasn't even reserved for the normal animal or the normal farm people. This was reserved for the really bad animals, the irrational ones, or the people that were so poor they barely had enough to get any food to eat. But this little boy was willing to give that up. Second, I know that this boy's mom was pretty smart. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure he was the only one that actually brought a lunch with him for the day. I mean, how many of you would go to follow Jesus for a whole day and then not even think to bring a lunch? That seems a little weird. But this boy's mom was smart enough to pack him a lunch, even if it was all that they had. Third, we know that this boy had remarkable faith. He was willing to give up his lunch for a bunch of people that he didn't know. This little boy didn't know if he was going to get any of the lunch, any of the pieces that were left over, but he gave it up anyway. And fourth, I want to add that this was a little boy. He might have been younger than us, or he could have been our age. It doesn't matter our age. We can still have something to bring to Jesus and for his kingdom. So this leads me to the two things that we can learn from this little boy. It teaches us that first, we must let it go. This little boy's lunch would have done no good if only he had eaten it. I don't know what you're hanging on to tonight, but I want to encourage you to let it go. Now, I'm not talking about hurt or some of the bad things that happen in our life, but I'm talking about the good things in our life, the things that we want to hold on to. This could look like our plans that we think are good for our future. It could be our finances. It could be any of the good things that we want to hold on to. But we need to let it go. Now, our society has this thing that's called a scarcity mindset. A scarcity mindset is a pattern of thinking that focuses on what you don't have and the underlying belief that you're not ever going to have the things that you want. We have this mindset that we're never going to have enough, and it pushes us to hold so tightly to the things that we do have that we don't share them. But God works the opposite. In Matthew 6:25-38, it shares with us that we don't need to be anxious because God has prepared everything for us. When I was studying Genesis 1, I noticed something. So when God created the world, every day, every creation section ends with, and it was evening and it was morning the first day, or the second day, so on and so forth. You guys know what I'm talking about? Yeah. But when we get to the seventh day, we don't see that refrain. And what happened on the seventh day? God rested, that's right. So we see that eventually on that seventh day, God had to step back. And he had to look at his creation, and he knew that he put everything on there that was needed. I know we can look at the news sometimes and we see people that are worried about global warming, or that we might not have oxygen. Some people might even say, the sun's going to burn up. And that can become real fears in our lives. We become surrounded with this idea that we're never going to have enough. And although we must steward those resources well, we have to trust that God has put everything on this earth that we need until he comes back. So, in all these ideas, I want to bring us back to the main idea. That we must let go, and I want to add, of all of it. This little very poor boy had enough faith to let go of his very small lunch, and he waited to see what would happen. He was willing to share, even if it meant that he got nothing. But moving forward, we see that something amazing happened. Jesus takes the food, blesses it, and breaks it. Everyone starts spreading it out, and everyone had enough. So let me encourage you with this second point, that we must not only let go of it, we must put it into God's hands. The key part to the story is that everyone didn't only get a small portion. They didn't just get a crumb of this boy's lunch, but they ate until they were filled. These people feasted on the small lunch that the boy had brought in. A lunch that might not even have filled just this boy in God's hands was able to totally fill up all 5,000 of those people. As I read this passage, I started to wonder what they did with the 12 basketfuls left over. And I like to think that maybe the little boy was able to take home just one basketful. That maybe since he stepped out in faith and gave up his only lunch for the day, that Jesus then gave him that one basketful, and he was able to feed his family for the few days after that. Matthew 16:19 takes us further, and it says, I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, I don't know about you guys, but every time I read this verse, I did not understand it. I mean, what does it mean to loose something on earth, or it will be loosed in heaven? That's not really the language that we use. But when Pastor Sam was preaching on Sunday, and I had this sermon in my heart, God began to speak to me. And I realized that it means when we hold on to something tightly on earth, then we're not going to experience the abundance of it even when we get to heaven. But if we let go of the things on earth and we put them into God's hands, then we might not see the abundance of it right now. We will see the abundance of it when we get to heaven. And we will eventually see what God has worked through that since we decided to let it go and to put it into his hands. So let's take a short moment, and I want you guys to think about what it is that you need to let go today. What you're holding on to so tightly that you need to let go and to put into God's hands. For me, this looks like finances. As I've been getting ready for college, how do you know that money is a big thing? I mean, college is really expensive. Some of you younger ones might not realize that yet, but you will soon. College is insanely expensive. And for a while, I had no idea where I wanted to go. If you remember me a couple years ago, I had my life figured out. I mean, younger Liv knew where she was going to go to college. She knew that it was going to be the cheap option. It was supposed to be close to home. It was going to be the easy thing for me to do. I knew what major I was going to major in. I knew everything. Until this past year when God began to speak to my heart, and I felt Him trying to shift my direction. But it took me a really long time to let go of the plans that I had for my life and to hold on to God's plans instead and to trust Him in my future. But when I did, some amazing things happened. But then money became to be a concern because Southeastern, where I was originally planning on going, is about half the amount that Valley Forge is. So Valley Forge was pretty much not, it was an option for me. There was no way for me to be able to pay for that. But as my financial aid has come in the past few weeks and as I've seen God begin to work, this college that I was never able to afford has become way more than affordable. God has began to work a miracle in my life. And impossible to pay for school became possible because I was willing to let go of what my plans for the future were, and I was willing to put them into God's hands and see what He wanted for my future. This wasn't possible because all of a sudden money just appeared in my bank account, but it was possible because God began to provide for me in ways I didn't even imagine. So for you, it could be something that you're good at. Maybe you're hanging on to a talent you have because you're so scared that if you let it go, you might get hurt. If you get vulnerable with it, you might get hurt. Maybe you're scared to participate in fine arts because if you show off your talent, maybe you might get some pretty harsh comments from the evaluators. But God might be challenging you to step out in faith because in God's hands, that talent could turn into an abundant future. Maybe you take those comments and you begin to improve. You take them to heart, right? And God can take that small hobby or talent and turn it into something for His kingdom and for His glory. So with that thing in mind, let's work to let it go. Sometimes we hold on to our plans so tightly and we say, but God, this is good. This is what I want for my life, and this is easy. But God's saying, put those plans in my hands, let me guide you, and you will live in abundance. If the little boy had held on to his lunch, then he might have eaten. Maybe he would have been full. But by putting it in God's hands, it was multiplied beyond belief. The boy saw his small lunch turn into abundant leftovers. I mean, I get it, guys. This is really tough stuff. We've all held on to something because when we let it go, we might get hurt. If we get vulnerable, we might get hurt. But God's challenging us to not see the scarcity of those things and the struggle of it, but rather to see the abundance when we let it go. We can't hold on to them so tightly. We must put them into God's hands and see what He can do. Let's pray. Dear God, I thank You for all of these students here before us, God. I just pray that You begin to help us to let the things go, that You begin to show us what we need to let go so that we can put it into Your hands, God. That we begin to not see the scarcity of it or the struggle of it, but God, that we would see the abundance that You have for us. Whether that looks like our plans for the future, our finances, or our talents, God, that we would be able to let it go and put it into Your hands, just like the little boy in our story. In Your name I pray, amen.